Good morning.
Morning.
One of my favorite friends needs to be over here for me. You know, I like to start with a story usually, and this may be one you've heard. I remember hearing this as a small child. I suspect it's apocryphal, but on the other hand, I expect it must have happened many a time in some fashion. Once upon a time, in a rural church, it was decided to hold a revival. And so they called in a very famous evangelist, and every night for a week, they gathered down by the river to hear him preach, and at the end of each one of these services, he would issue a call to see if anyone had been saved. Well, night after night, new converts came forward, and when they did, the evangelist took each and every one of them down into the river to be baptized and to make a confession of faith. And all of that went very smoothly until the evening that little Johnny came forward. The preacher took this 10-year-old boy out into the river and very carefully lowered him into the water until he was completely submerged. And when he brought Johnny back to the surface, the evangelist shouted at him, "Do you believe?" But little Johnny did not say anything. And so the minister looked at him again and dunked him again and raised him back up and bellowed out, "Do you believe?" But the boy remained silent. And so it was the third time that the silver-tongued orator dunked the little boy, holding him under just a little bit longer than before. And finally, when he allowed the youngster to stand up once again, he yelled out, "Do you believe?" And this time, gasping for air, little Johnny shouted back, "I believe! I believe! I believe you're trying to drown me!" I believe. Most confessions of faith begin with those little words. When Latin was used in the church, it took only one word to say "I believe," and that word was credo. And from it, we get the English term creed. As Brian Burrell has pointed out in his wonderful book, The Words We Live By, before there were any creeds at all, people somehow managed to get along just fine without them. Once they came into use, however, creeds multiplied like rabbits. Now, most people think of creeds as being theological pronouncements, but statements of faith do not need to be religious to function as creeds. From 1952 to 1959, for example, one of the most popular radio features in America was a 5-minute program entitled, some of you may have heard this one, "This I Believe." It was hosted by Edward R. Murrow, and the show featured the living philosophies of successful men and women from all walks of life. Harry Truman on that show said, "I believe in the moral code based upon the 10 Commandments and in the Sermon on the Mount." Adlai Stevenson declared, "I believe in generosity, in liberty, and in the rights of man." Carl Sandburg, one of my favorites, said simply, "I believe in platitudes." Other contributors that you might have heard were Pearl Buck, Aldous Huxley, James Michener, Margaret Chase Smith, Herbert Hoover, Jackie Robinson, many other celebrities, as well as many ordinary men and women. Now, historically, creeds arose because, well, frankly, it's easier to believe than to doubt. And because creeds can, if used properly, serve very useful social purposes. Now, for these reasons, most people have sworn allegiance to some creeds. In America, in the not-so-distant past, prominent citizens who felt secure in their own beliefs made a point of letting their beliefs be known. Excellent examples of this abound among the founding fathers, for example, who were simply consumed by the issue of belief and who frequently issued creeds of various sorts to try to justify their endeavors. Some of these were very public statements of faith, such as the Declaration of Independence, with its famous words, "We hold these truths to be self-evident." But many of these were private statements put forth in personal letters. Unitarian Thomas Jefferson, for example, wrote to a friend, quote, "I hold the precepts of Jesus to be the most pure, benevolent, and sublime which have ever been preached." Benjamin Franklin and others also issued their own private statements of belief, and these almost always echoed, but did not quite fully coincide with, the Christian church's more public creeds. Indeed, the rejection of organized religion in favor of a personal conception of God is one of the hallmarks of American thinking. This is especially exemplified in the very popular 19th century lawyer and rhetorician whose name has already appeared on the screen this morning, Robert G. Ingersoll. Known widely as the great agnostic, he promulgated a humanistic philosophy summarized in what came to be known as the Ingersoll Creed. This is what it says: justice is the only worship. Love is the only priest. Ignorance is the only slavery. Happiness is the only good. The time to be happy is now. The place to be happy is here. And the way to be happy is to make others happy. Now, there is an important difference between public and private creeds, and it comes into sharp focus in people like Tom Paine. Remember him? He wrote a little book, The Age of Reason, and in it he stated his personal creed in the following words. He said, "I believe in one God and no more, and I hope for happiness beyond this life. I believe in the equality of man, and I believe that religious duties consist of doing justice, loving mercy, and endeavoring to make our fellow creatures happy. I do not believe in the creed professed by the Jewish, Roman, Greek, Turkish, or Protestant church, nor by any church. My own mind is my church." Now, note Paine's last sentence. My own mind is my church. As Brian Burrell says in his book, Paine's is the creed of a very exceptional man, a congregation of one. And, in fact, Paine, he points out, found that to be a very lonely and a very thankless lot. By disavowing any public creed, Paine placed himself beyond organized religion. By taking such creeds too literally, seeing them as supposed literal truths instead of as statements of affiliation, his own sense of enlightenment led Paine to condemn those who, for convenience or for mere loyalty's sake, or out of a desire simply to belong, swear to the creed of their fathers. Paine failed to notice, as Burrell, that to seek community with others, or that someone might adopt a creed without reading all of the fine print, is common and fine. Nor did he see how a creed might represent nothing more than an occasion to reflect upon one's place in the world, on the value of life, or on the reality of death. Now, if one takes institutional creeds seriously, but not literally, then there can, in fact, be many good reasons to adopt creeds. But if they are taken merely as hypothetical guidelines or as social symbols of comradeship, they can also establish a frame of reference, an identity, an affiliation, a sense of belonging, or a sense of affinity. Used in all of these ways, creeds can, in fact, serve as statements of our original intent. They can help establish the institutions which shape our lives. and they can give us good comfort and inspiration by describing our own common destiny, identity, and purpose. If, I say, creeds are used that way, if they are taken seriously, but not literally, then good things can happen and they can be enjoyed. But the problem is, they're almost never treated that way. Neither the priests nor the pains of this world allow it. Instead, the priests tend to demand that all of these pious proclamations be taken literally, not only as gospel, but also as historical and scientific truth. In turn, out of self-defense, of course, the pains of this world are forced then to respond in kind and debate creeds, not upon their symbolic or social merit, but upon their literal demerit, as historical and scientific falsehoods. This failure to take them seriously but not literally is the problem with creeds, and it has many manifestations. First of all, creeds are seldom understood by the common people. As Burrell writes, to the modern churchgoer, creeds are formulas to be recited rather than information to be comprehended. And I, for one, have seen this myself in many of the churches that I have served. In a Christian Disciples of Christ congregation, for example, many years ago, I once tape recorded the voices of the dozen elderly members who gathered weekly on Wednesday mornings to recite the Lord's Prayer, and then to pray for their friends and neighbors who were in need. I was astonished as we went through those meetings to discover that most of the people present got the words wrong. And so I asked them one morning to write out the words to the Lord's Prayer. Out of about 13 people, not one got it right, even after having prayed it in that church before my time there for decades. Ritual recitation had replaced rational contemplation. Now, in a United Church of Christ congregation that I served at one point, the folks there recited the Nicene Creed every Sunday. And so at one point I held a study session on that creed, and I asked if anyone could explain to everybody present what it meant to say that Jesus was begotten, not made, one in being with the Father, or why it said that the Holy Spirit proceeds from the Father and from, but not through, the Son, or what the word Catholic or what the word apostolic mean. No one in the congregation could do that. Further proof that understanding of creeds is not even expected is found in the Catholic Church's past use of Latin, which only the priests could read normally, and in the fact that in every religion, the understanding of any creed diminishes over time, no matter how white hot it may have been when the creed was first formulated. The second manifestation of the problem with creeds is the fact that they stifle thought. Usually, the authority figures in charge of creeds actively discourage asking questions or raising doubts about them. As John Locke observed, quote, false and doubtful positions relied upon as unquestionable maxims keep those who build upon them in the dark from the truth. Now, understanding all of that led Unitarian Ralph Waldo Emerson to write, quote, as men's prayers are a disease of the will, so are his creeds a disease of the intellect. The third manifestation of the problem with creeds is the fact that they stifle freedom not only intellectually but sometimes physically. The poet Swinburne was right to say a creed is a rod. For throughout history, those in power have used creeds to beat the powerless into submission. Those imprisoned tortured and murdered by the Inquisition, provide an infamous example. Besides bodies trapped in dungeons, minds are also denied freedom because creeds never really change. But life goes on, and science discovers new truths. But, as Shelley warned us, if we are not careful, we can be suffocated from the dust of creeds outworn. A fourth manifestation of the problem with creeds is that they are divisive and often deadly. Every congregation, and you know this, I'm sure, has members who refuse to recite some or all of the creeds that the congregation uses. Every congregation also has what usually are called friends who attend, quite often usually, but refuse to join because something in the creeds bothers them. More than divisions within congregations, creeds have been the root cause of every division and every schism between different religions and between the denominations within any religion. Such divisions have always brought with them bloodshed and death. A fifth manifestation of the problem with creeds is that they are often morally and ethically offensive. In his History of European Morals, for example, William Lecky offered a prime example when he wrote this, quote, "The Augustinian doctrine of the damnation of unbaptized infants and the Calvinistic doctrine of reprobation surpassed in atrocity any tenets that have ever been admitted into any pagan creed." Because of all of these manifestations of the problems with creeds, many religions do without them, and in fact do not require agreement with them as a prerequisite for membership. Some examples may surprise you. These are creedless examples: Baptists, Christian Scientists, Disciples of Christ, Jehovah's Witnesses, Jews, Methodists, Quakers, Seventh-day Adventists, and Unitarian Universalists. You knew about that last one, didn't you? Rather than being purely spiritual promulgations, many creeds arose out of political turmoil and out of ecclesiastical scandal. As Brian Burrell observes, the tumultuous origins of the ancient creeds cost them much of their credibility among modern free thinkers. Now, of course, there never has been a bunch of freer thinkers than Unitarian Universalists. We have forever been suspicious of anything that might be taken as a binding creed. Our European forebears were wise enough to understand the problems with creeds. If their intellectual investigations had not convinced them, then their abuse at the hands of theological tyrants would have done so. Persecutions in our history abound. I need only mention Michael Servetus and Joseph Priestley, I hope, to remind you of the horrors that could come to anyone in our history who repudiated Christianity's party line. Now, in this country, Unitarians like Emerson stood firmly against creeds. In a history-making sermon, likewise, Unitarian Theodore Parker explained how doctrines, rituals, and creeds are among the transient things within Christianity and how we should let them go. Such things, on the other hand, such permanent things as the ethical teachings of Jesus, he said we should hold on to. Now, most Unitarians agreed, and they wanted their religion to be creedless. If you know your history, however, you know that was not that simple. Because there were occasional attempts within Unitarianism to establish binding Unitarian creeds. After the Civil War, for example, Henry Whitney Bellows led the most famous or infamous effort. Radical Unitarians bolted from the movement and formed the so-called Free Religious Association. They were led by ministers like William James Potter, who in the infamous yearbook controversy had their names dropped from the Unitarian rolls because they believed that reason demanded non-creedalism. Potter wanted to establish a spiritual anti-slavery movement within Unitarianism. Western Unitarians at that time agreed with him, but those in the East, oh no, they wanted a creed to prevent Unitarianism from becoming non-Christian. That was their issue. Things were not settled until 1894, when a new Unitarian Constitution declared, quote, nothing in it, the Constitution, was to be construed as an authoritative test for membership. And from that point forward, Unitarianism has been uncompromisingly non-creedal. Now, Universalism, our other half, had its own struggle along these lines. Founded in America in 1793, Universalism established what was called the Winchester Profession of Belief in 1803. That document contained a very famous liberty clause. It stated the following: while we adopt a general profession of belief, we leave it to the churches to adopt such articles of faith as may appear to them best under their particular circumstances, provided they do not disagree with our general profession. In 1848, Universalism turned very much more conservative. Its liberty clause remained, but ministers were now required to declare that the Bible was a, quote, special revelation from God, sufficient for faith and practice, end quote. And then in 1870, the liberty clause was abandoned. And there followed 30 years of heresy trials for those who didn't sign on board various creeds. It was not until 1899 that the liberty clause was reinstated, and it was not until 1935 that Universalism became officially and finally and forever non-creedal. Today, Unitarian Universalism promotes principles and purposes. You've heard about them already. These, however, are not creeds. They are statements of general but not unanimous denominational consensus. No one is required to swear allegiance to them in order to become a member of any congregation, nor does every member have to agree with every word that appears in them. There is, for example, as you probably know, an ongoing and somewhat warm debate about whether or not the word potential might not have been better than the word inherent in the first principle, which states that we affirm the inherent worth and dignity of every person. In any case, Unitarian Universalism is today adamantly non-creedal. A brochure for the Unitarian Universalists for Freedom of Conscience says the following, and I quote, historically, Unitarians have supported the non-creedal principle for two reasons. First, truth changes. And if religious principles are frozen into written creeds, people are unable to grow and change intellectually. By not establishing a creed, the Free Church encourages the growth of its members. Second, by not having a creed, people in the church are free from coercion. The brochure then goes on to say this: we believe that the same principles which keep our free churches from establishing a theological creed ought also to apply to political matters. The Free Church, it says, ought to deal with all ethical and moral issues, but the Free Church must let the individual carry his or her principles into the wider society. Good Unitarian Universalists can be found on both sides of most issues. The church should not presume to speak for one side or the other, nor should it presume to make judgments on these very complex issues which divide Unitarian Universalists. We would prefer not to have someone else speak for us, especially not the church, which promises us a non-creedal haven. Now, as I said, there are no creeds in contemporary Unitarian Universalism, and no one in any congregation speaks for anyone else. All of us agree with the anti-creedal sentiment which these writers that I just quoted have expressed. None of us wants our freedom curtailed by any sort of creed, because we understand thoroughly the problem with creeds. People refuse to take them seriously, but not literally. And so creeds, as it turns out, are not understood. They stifle thought, they stifle freedom, they are divisive, and they can become offensive. As Unitarian Universalists, therefore, we agree with the words of nobody else other than John F. Kennedy when he said this: "The wave of the future is not the conquest of this world by a single dogmatic creed, but the liberation of the diverse energies of free nations and free individuals."